Hey everyone, in this review we're going to take a closer look at the gaming performance of the new 15-inch Acer Nitro V15 gaming laptop, which in today's video features the brand new NVIDIA RTX 5050 mobile with now finally 8GB of GDDR7 VRAM and a memory bus of 128-bit. It also comes with an older Intel Core i7-13620H. Unfortunately, only one stick of 16GB DDR4 3200 mega transfer RAM, a 512GB SSD and a 15-inch Full HD IPS screen with 165Hz, no adaptive sync, as well as a 150-watt charger, while it will be available in different configurations with other GPUs and CPUs. Now, besides the disappointing fact of it only getting one stick of DDR4 RAM, which means this one is running in single-channel mode only, we need to talk about the RTX 5050 mobile and its power limit in this laptop. While in general, the new NVIDIA GeForce RTX 5050 mobile can use up to 115 watt, in this Acer Nitro V15, the GPU is once again, just like in previous V15s, specified with only up to 75 watt, and that includes dynamic boost, which is not always in effect. And that actually means in many games I only saw a power usage of around 60, 50 or sometimes, well, even below 40 watt, especially at 1080p, which is the native resolution for this 15-inch laptop. And that is massively holding back the gaming performance of the Nitro V15. While GPUs tend to become more efficient at lower wattages, in here it's often only using 50% of its maximum wattage. And as you'll see in the benchmarks, the old CPU also plays a big part in that. Now, considering this laptop cost me 1,150 euros, which equals around $1,300, that's going to be a terrible FPS per dollar ratio, and probably any RTX 4060 mobile laptop is going to be a better choice for that matter. Now, prices will surely come down after a while, like they always do, but still, it is not communicated in a clear way that it is such a hamster gaming laptop, and a few years back NVIDIA at least communicated that by labeling these low-powered GPUs as Max-Q. But now let's jump into the benchmarks in alphabetical order, which all have been recorded at the laptop's turbo mode with the fan set to auto, using an external capture card in a desktop PC. And today we'll start with a comparison against an RTX 4060, also at 75 watt, in a very cheap Gigabyte G5 from over 2 years ago, which is a laptop I don't really like, but it did have a good price to FPS ratio for sure. And after that, we'll also take a closer look at how it performs in around 20 recent and popular games.
Okay, so these recordings are a bit older because I don't have that Gigabyte G5 anymore, so please take these videos with a grain of salt, or these results with a grain of salt. They're not 100% accurate, but they will give us a good idea of what to compare it to. So in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, the RTX 5050 actually is pretty close to the RTX 4060 here, with 84 FPS on average for the 5050 and 86 FPS on average for the 4060. So that's almost identical in this case. Also, coincidentally, both GPUs are actually using more or less the same wattage for this benchmark run. In the benchmark for Cyberpunk 2077 at ultra settings and 1080p without any upscaling, the RTX 5050 was actually a bit faster with 68 FPS on average over 66 FPS for the RTX 4060 in the Gigabyte G5. But we have to factor in that the game did get a lot of updates since then, and probably the drivers, so it's once again not 100% accurate, but once more it's almost identical. In Far Cry 6 at ultra settings and 1080p, the RTX 5050 was actually a bit behind compared to the 4060, with 89 FPS on average over 98 FPS for the 4060, despite the Gigabyte G5 having the slower i5 CPU in this case. So it's probably more GPU related, because the drivers have been updated and the game has probably been updated since then. Well, it is what it is. And in Forza Horizon 5, the result was once more almost identical, with 96 FPS for the 5050 and 97 FPS for the 4060 at 1080p and ultra settings. While here the RTX 5050 seems to use a bit less power for that result, so it seems to be a bit more efficient than the RTX 4060. And in Hogwarts Legacy at high settings, 1080p with DLSS on quality, both have been identical once more with around 73 FPS on average. While here the RTX 5050 does use a bit less power for the GPU than the 4060 laptop. So overall, we could state that both GPUs are more or less identical depending on the game, depending on the CPU load and depending on the wattage they use, but it's more or less the same. So next up, let's have a look at 20 games in specific for the RTX 5050 in this Acer Nitro V15. The first game for today will be Assassin's Creed Shadows, which is very demanding hardware-wise, but at least the frame times are super smooth and there's no stuttering whatsoever. I was using the medium preset with DLSS on quality, which allowed me to get 63 FPS on average with very good 1% loss of 50 FPS. This would actually be good enough to make use of frame gen if you're okay with the additional input lag. However, as you can see in this game, the GPU does not use the full 75 watt and is usually around 50 to 65 watt instead, while the temperatures both for the CPU and the GPU are pretty good, even with the fans set to auto and very acceptable noise levels. The CPU definitely doesn't seem to throttle and mostly hovers around 4 GHz. So we're actually getting a very doable gaming experience in this case, though it's on medium settings at 1080p only, so keep that in mind. Now for Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, I was using the medium preset once again with DLSS on performance this time, and frame gen was turned off. The average FPS actually seemed to be okay at first, while the frame times and 1% lows haven't been good to say the least, though after a while of playing, the game suddenly had severe frame drops to 30 FPS and terrible stuttering. And in the end, the game even crashed on me. So that was not a good gaming experience at all, even with medium settings and DLSS on performance. I'd actually kinda call it unplayable. Might be the game, might be the brand new drivers, I'm just showing you what I experienced. Also look at the GPU wattage, it drops below 40 watt. Well, also the 8 GB of VRAM makes sense here with a VRAM usage of around 7.3 GB. I've tested Baldur's Gate 3 at 1080p with ultra settings and DLSS on quality, which resulted in around 70 to 140 FPS in Act 1, depending on the area I was walking around in, and around 52 FPS on average in the city of Baldur's Gate in Act 3. Here, slight stutters aren't a problem compared to other games due to the round-based nature of the fights, and it would surely be very enjoyable and playable with these ultra settings despite the sometimes lower 1% lows of 20 to 40, while I have to point out that stuttering can be reduced by playing longer sessions when everything was loaded at least once. I don't own Black Myth Wukong, so I was using the free benchmark tool instead. At 1080p with high settings and DLSS set to 66%, I saw a good average of 68 FPS and 1% lows of 53. So once again, using frame gen could make sense, and considering I use high settings, there is still some headroom if you're using medium settings instead. Also, one of the few occasions where the Acer Nitro V15 would actually use 70 to 75 watt for the RTX 5050 mobile. To be honest, CS2 was a bit disappointing with only 187 FPS on average using the low preset without FSR at 1080p. While the 1% lows are traditionally low in this game, probably due to a reading error or some issue with the engine, the game feels quite smooth nonetheless. And while 187 FPS surely is playable just fine, especially on a 165Hz screen, I was expecting a bit more, but I guess the single stick of 16GB DDR4 RAM also plays a bigger part in this. In Cyberpunk 2077, I was actually using FrameGen by 2 at 1080p with high settings and DLSS on balance using the new transformer model. That resulted in an average FPS of 114 with only 35 FPS for the 1% lows due to the lower base FPS of around 50 to 60. I mean, it is playable despite some hiccups, but it doesn't feel as fluid as it should have overall, while I didn't notice a much higher input lag all things considered, and the game is still looking decent overall. Due to the high CPU load in this title, the GPU is once more not able to get the maximum wattage because of the way the laptop is using the available power budget. If you're okay with medium settings, some ray tracing options could probably be turned on if we consider we're still having some VRAM headroom left in this case. Diablo 4 ran well enough at 1080p with ultra settings, while DLSS was actually turned off completely. Around 95 FPS on average and 1% lows of 55 FPS. And even in heavier fights, the frame rate seemed to stay relatively stable. Definitely enjoyable and playable for sure. The game is not utilizing the CPU a lot, as you can see here, so more power was left for the GPU in this case. However, let's jump right to the next game. And that is Elden Ring, for which I was using the high preset at 1080p with FPS between 55 and 60, which resulted in around 58 on average and 1% lows of around 40 FPS. Definitely playable, while for a stable 60 FPS in all cases, we'd probably have to use medium settings instead, as it seems. What's really weird though is that even when the FPS wasn't hitting the 60 FPS cap, the GPU wasn't using much more than 30 watt. So that actually looks like a bug. I don't know, maybe such will be addressed with further BIOS or driver updates, but it's far from optimal, to be honest. I was testing Fortnite at 1080p with the medium preset running the DirectX 12 mode and DLSS set to quality. That resulted in an average of 105 FPS and 1% lows of 49, while the 1% lows might get a bit better after a few matches when everything was loaded at least once from my experience. Overall, very playable, and we surely get some headroom for more FPS using the performance mode of the game instead. However, I once more wanted to point out the very low GPU usage. Now, I think this is really due to the older and weaker i7-13620H and the one lonely stick of DDR4 RAM in here. Not an optimal combination, as we can see. For Forza Horizon 5, I was both testing 1080p and 4K. Let's first have a look at 1080p with ultra settings and MSAA by 2. 109 FPS on average and good 1% lows of 75 FPS. GPU usage around 55 to 65 watt. Very playable, fast and responsive with decent graphics. However, it is still playable at 4K with 54 FPS on average and stable high 1% lows of 47 that way, very close to the average FPS. And here you can see that since this puts so much more load on the GPU, the usage is higher and the GPU constantly runs with 72 to 75 watt, since the load balancing is just leaning in favor of the GPU now, while the CPU has much less work to do in calculating stuff at this lower frame rate. For the new GTI 5 Enhanced Edition, I wanted to see if the RTX 5050 Mobile can actually do some proper ray tracing, so I chose high settings with DLSS on quality and put all the RT settings to high at 1080p. That resulted in very good 90 FPS on average and 1% lows of 58, while the game surely looks neat with the better lighting and stuff. And we could even further raise the usual normal settings a bit higher, maybe to very high or ultra, and still get over 60 FPS here. Helldivers 2 was very playable with 60 FPS on average using the high preset at the display's native resolution of 1080p without any upscaling activated. The game is usually pretty smooth and stable on most systems, and the 1% lows have been okay as well with around 42 FPS. Even in heavier firefights, the FPS didn't drop noticeably. Once more, I want to point out the low GPU usage in both the percentage and the wattage it's using. The 60% CPU usage indicates that all the 6 performance cores of the CPU are actually probably fully utilized, and the CPU is just not able to push out a lot more here, bottlenecking the GPU again. I just said it before, that's not a good GPU and CPU combo, I think. Hogwarts Legacy is surely suffering by the CPU and single-channel RAM combination, and in crowded areas the frame time graph looked pretty horrible to me. While the average FPS have been okay at 1080p with high settings and DLSS set to quality, the 1% lows have been pretty bad overall with 21 FPS on average. Now, the game does suffer from occasional transfer stuttering due to the Unreal Engine, but on this laptop it wasn't a great experience, to be honest. I'd probably prefer medium settings and an FPS cap at 60 for a bit more stable experience. And by the way, FrameGen totally destroyed the experience here with unplayable behavior due to extreme stuttering, so it's actually absolutely useless in this case and I didn't use it. For Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, at first I was like, oh, it's gonna be fine with medium settings at 1080p and DLSS on performance, right? Well, sure, if you enjoy a good slideshow of the Vatican, go for it. But jokes aside, the VRAM usage was already too high for the 8GB of GDDR7 VRAM, which is absolutely pathetic. You cannot play this game on this RTX 5050 mobile laptop with medium settings. It's like 12 to 14 FPS on average. And since the single channel 16GB of DDR4 RAM can't compensate that in any circumstances, it's a real failure. So I was using the low preset with DLSS on quality instead, which immediately changed everything. Now I saw 48 to 53 FPS on average, depending on the area and the Vatican, and okay 1% lows of 33 to 38 FPS. Well, I don't even know what to say about that anymore, to be honest, but being forced to use low settings on a $1,200 laptop at its release with less than 60 FPS. I mean, look at the GPU power usage. It even drops below 30 watt. I mean, come on. However, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is always a joy testing on any system, and it never disappoints with great graphics and an even better performance thanks to its superb optimization. Probably my favorite game out there to show developers what's possible and what should be expected. 1080p at high settings with DLSS on quality using the new transformer model resulted in a great average of 78 FPS and good 1% lows of 58, while the game is clearly utilizing more watt for the GPU than most other titles I've tested on the Acer Nitro V15. I don't own Monster Hunter Wilds as well, so I was once more using the free integrated benchmark tool instead. And considering the performance, I probably never will own it, I guess. Only 52 FPS on average with medium settings and DLSS set to performance, while the game actually looks quite blurry that way. The 1% lows aren't exactly something to brag about as well with 27 FPS. And in some scenes the FPS actually drops to the low 40s. So excuse me when I say next game please. Which is PUBG, and that ran pretty well with the medium preset at 1080p. 130 FPS on average and 1% lows of 73. Now, the game isn't exactly new and it did get some optimization over the years for sure, but I wasn't sure what to expect here. However, once more, the GPU is held back a lot by the old Intel i7 in here. Though, nevertheless, it is absolutely playable with high FPS even on the Nitro V15, and it's enjoyable for sure. For Red Dead Redemption 2, I was once more testing both 1080p and 4K. Starting with 1080p using the Hardware Unbox recommended settings with TAA on medium, so no upscaling in effect. That resulted in good 77 FPS on average, while the game still looks amazing that way. The 1% lows have been good as well with 54 FPS on average. One of the best looking experiences of today's video with decent frame rates at the same time. And the best part is, it was even absolutely playable with these settings at 4K, now using DLSS and performance. But that way the game looks so much sharper, while it's still providing playable FPS. Kudos to Hardware Unbox for providing us these great settings, by the way. And you can look them up via Google if you want to use them. In The Last of Us Part 2, I saw a decent 66 FPS on average using the high preset with DLSS and quality, while FrameGen was turned off. But with these kind of base FPS, you could definitely use it if you'd want to. In some areas of the tested map, I did get some noticeable stuttering, which kinda destroyed the 1% lows, but overall I'd say it's playable just fine nonetheless, as this is one of the harder areas for the hardware. Though, take a look at that CPU utilization here. Clearly something is not right again. And we'll finish today's benchmark run with The Witcher 3, working pretty well using the next-gen version in the Ultra preset at 1080p with DLSS on quality and FrameGen activated. And here FrameGen really makes sense in my opinion, 110 FPS on average and good 1% lows of 70 FPS, a decent flat frame time graph, good graphics, very playable, not much to say to be honest.
Okay, well, the best thing that I can say about the Acer Nitro V15 is that the cooling system is very good. The temperatures are pretty low and the noise levels are absolutely okay if you're not setting the fans to their maximum speed, but that really wasn't necessary, at least for me, at an ambient temperature of around 22 degrees Celsius. But thanks to the low wattage, the Nitro V15 stays cool and quiet mostly all of the time. Be aware that the pretty old i7-13620H is already holding back the RTX 5050 Mobile, especially at 1080p, and that will most likely become a bigger issue in the future. So maybe this is probably one of the worst performing RTX 5050 mobiles we'll ever see. Low wattage, old CPU and single channel DDR4 RAM. Note that if you're getting a V15 with 32GB and 2 sticks of RAM, you could probably expect around 10 to 15% better results and better frame times and 1% lows. Sure, I mean, as we saw, it is able to game to at least some extent, but for the current price, it's just not good enough considering the good deals we saw for older RTX 4060 laptops in the last few months. Yeah, okay, it does support NVIDIA multi-frame gen, but meh. With these base FPS, that often won't make a lot of sense, so I'd personally stick to frame gen by 2 anyhow, which was already supported in the RTX 4000 mobile series. And that's all for today's review. If you like the content, make sure to like the video and or subscribe to the channel for more laptop, mini PC, gaming handheld and integrated graphics stuff. Thanks for watching, see you next time, bye bye and tschüss.